My Preparing for the Time of Trouble seminar that you have already viewed has traditionally been a 5-part presentation, but I felt the importance of adding a part 6. You will recall that we used the book Country Living as one of our resources, and there were numerous quotations that we used in the seminar that urged people to move into the country. And the overall emphasis of this presentation is the importance of living in the country and to be independently sustainable and how to go about doing that. But this part 6 has to do with timing, because if you read the little 32-page book Country Living, you would find quotations that would say, in the future we need to move into the country. You'll find some other ones that said we should have already moved in the country. So what's the deal with that? This presentation is intended to add some light to that question. It has to do with the Blair Bill, but let's go back to the Country Living book, page 32. Here's one of the quotes that is pretty important to this whole conversation. The time is not far distant when, like the early disciples, we shall be forced to seek refuge in desolate and solitary places. By the way, this particular quote is one that some people will use to justify not moving into the country, by virtue of the fact that the first line says, the time is not far distant. So you will notice from this quote that the trigger point for when it's time to move is when there is this National Sunday Law. So let's read it again with that in mind, and you can see how people could jump to that conclusion if they only use this one quote. Starting again, the time is not far distant when, like the early disciples, we shall be forced to seek refuge in desolate and solitary places. As the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman armies was the signal for flight by the Judean Christians, so the assumption of power on the part of our nation in the decree enforcing the papal Sabbath will be a warning to us. It will then be time to leave the large cities, preparatory to leaving the smaller ones, for retired homes in secluded places among the mountains. So this statement, this paragraph, would seem to indicate that number one, it's in the future. Number two, then when this National Sunday Law happens, then that's the sign to leave the large cities, and then eventually the smaller ones, and eventually go into the mountains. The problem is there are other quotations in the same book that talk as though it already happened. So what is the issue here? That is the point of this seminar. Let's go back to the Bible. Matthew 24:15-16. Jesus is talking here. He's responding to his disciples as they overlook the beauty of the temple in Jerusalem. And the disciples knew that Jesus was the Messiah. They knew that he had made the statement that this temple would be destroyed and there wouldn't be one stone left upon another. And it just blew them away because this just didn't seem possible. They also knew that he was going to be the Messiah and fix all the wrongs in the world. In their mind, they thought it was the Romans, but we know better now that he was talking about saving the whole world. So, in answer to their question, they asked two questions. They didn't know it was two questions. They asked, when will these things be? When will the temple be destroyed? And when will be your coming? They didn't realize those were two different events. They thought both were going to happen in their lifetime, right away. Jesus, as only God could do, answered both questions with one answer, and they were both right. So watch carefully. When you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. O Jerusalem, O Jerusalem. Now this is Matthew 23:37 to 39, which is before this. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto you, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. So back to Matthew 24, Jesus went out, departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. So that we're backing up. This is what happened before Jesus answered the question. They went out, and the disciples came to him and showed him, hey, Jesus, look at this beautiful temple. This is fantastic. This will be here forever. And Jesus said, see ye not all these things? See the temple? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one stone upon another, that thou shalt not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? They're thinking of the destruction of the temple. And what will be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? So the disciples thought it was the same thing. They thought that the destruction of the temple would be done at the end of the world when Jesus came. But we know, and Jesus knew, that it's two events thousands of years apart. But in his wisdom, he answered both questions with one answer. The answer was, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them which are in Judea flee into the mountains. The Great Controversy, which is a well-known bestseller book by the same author of Country Living, page 23 to 31, explains in detail about this particular conversation. All of the predictions given by Christ concerning the destruction of Jerusalem were fulfilled to the letter. The Jews, including the disciples, experienced the truth of his words of warning. With what measure you meet, you shall measure to you again. Matthew 7:2. So the destruction of Jerusalem was something that the disciples anticipated, and the early Christian church knew about this. They knew that Jesus had prophesied that there was going to be this destruction by the Romans. So they were looking forward to that event. Signs and wonders appeared. We're continuing the Great Controversy statements. Signs and wonders appeared, foreboding disaster and doom. This is talking about the actual destruction. In the midst of a night, an unnatural light shone over the temple and the altar. Upon the clouds at sunset were pictured chariots and men of war gathering for battle. The priests ministering by night in the sanctuary were terrified by the mysterious sounds. The earth trembled, and a multitude of voices were heard crying, let us depart hence. The great eastern gate of Jerusalem, of the temple, which was so heavy that it could hardly be shut by a score of men, a score is 20, and which was secured by immense bars of iron fastened deep in the pavement of the solid stone, opened at midnight without visible agency. This is according to the History of the Jews book by Milman. This was quoted in Great Controversy. We're continuing the Great Controversy description. For 7 years, a man continued to go up and down the streets of Jerusalem, declaring the woes that were to come upon the city. By day and by night, he chanted a wild dirge. A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and against the temple, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, the voice against the whole people. This is quoting that same history book within a quote within Great Controversy. Continuing again, this strange being was imprisoned and scourged, but no complaint escaped his lips. To insult and abuse he answered only, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem! Woe, woe to the inhabitants thereof!" His warning cry ceased not until he was slain in the siege he had foretold. Then a really interesting statement was made. Not one Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, how is it possible that the destruction of Jerusalem would be so complete and yet not one Christian perished? Christ had given his disciples the warning, which we read about just earlier at the beginning, and all who believed his words watched for the promised sign. This individual who died proclaiming woe to Jerusalem did not believe the sign, even though he was preaching that there was going to be judgments on Jerusalem. He did not believe the sign. Here's the sign. When you shall see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, Jesus said, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out. Quoting Luke 21:20 and 21. After the Romans, we're continuing with great controversies description. After the Romans under Cestius had surrounded the city, they unexpectedly abandoned the siege when everything seemed favorable for an immediate attack. Now, there were two attacks, two sieges on Jerusalem. The first one is Cestius, and a siege is when, which was fairly typical strategy for attacking castles or walled cities, is they would just starve them out by surrounding the city and not letting anybody come or go. That's what a siege is. So when Cestius came with his Roman armies, they surrounded the city and starved them out. Now, the Christians knew from the disciples telling them what Jesus had said, knew that that was the sign. That when the Roman armies surrounded the city, they knew it was time to flee. So what made this interesting is this particular day when this happened was a feast day of the Jews, and all of the Jews had come to Jerusalem. The city was swelling with Jews, and among them were Christians. And so the Christian Jews that were inside the city were now trapped because the Roman armies had surrounded the city and were starving them out. But they knew it was the sign. So they were looking and going, hey, wait a minute. This is when we're supposed to flee the city. But we can't. We're trapped. So they kept watching. The besieged, despairing of successful resistance, were at the point of surrender. The Jews were so starving and so shriveled up from not being able to get water and food and all that, they were ready to give up. They were on the point of surrender when the Roman general withdrew his forces without the least apparent reason. Wow. So here's the Jews, the Christian Jews, who knew the sign, who were looking for the sign, recognized the sign, didn't see any way of escape. All of a sudden, the Roman general took up his toys and left. Continuing, but God's merciful providence had directed events for the good of his own people. So God had made it possible for the Christians who were watching for the sign to be able to escape because the Roman armies left. Not only that, watch this. The promised sign had been given to the waiting Christians, and now an opportunity was offered to them who would to obey the Savior's words. Events were so overruled that neither Jews nor Romans should hinder the flight of the Christians. So what happened is that when the Romans left, the soldiers of the Jews said, hey, aren't we great? And so the whole Israeli army chased after the Romans and went off into the sunset, leaving the gates wide open. So now these Christian Jews in the city who had recognized the sign and knew it was time to flee to the mountains, not only did the Romans disappear, but so did the police, the soldiers of the city. So now they had no encumbrance and the gates left wide open. So now it's just a matter of, do we have the faith to recognize the sign and do what we were told? And that was to flee to the mountains. Upon the retreat of Cestius, the Jews sallying, from Jerusalem, pursued after the retiring army. So the Israeli forces went after the Roman army, and while both forces were thus fully engaged, the Christians had an opportunity to leave the city. At this time, the country also had been cleared of enemies who might have endeavored to intercept them. So the coast was completely clear. At the time of the siege, the Jews were assembled at the Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, and thus the Christians throughout the land were able to make their escape unmolested. Without delay, they fled to a place of safety, the city of Pella in the land of Perea beyond the Jordan. So they not only recognized the sign, God providentially made it possible for them to get out and flee to the country, and they did it. All of them left. All of the Christians left. That's why none of the Christians died when the Jerusalem was destroyed later. Now, I've grown up knowing this story, and I just couldn't picture that there were any mountains. And when Jesus said flee to the mountains, I'm thinking of just this desert, area of the Middle East. But I found on the internet a picture of Pella. This is Pella, and you can see it's in mountains. And it has green and it has trees. What you see in the middle left is a ruin of one of the Christian churches that was built there. And in the upper left is another ruin of a Christian church. So the Christians that fled Jerusalem, when they saw the sign, they literally did go into the country, into the mountains. It was country living. And they were there long enough to build churches. The promised sign had been given to the waiting Christians, and now the opportunity was offered for all who would to obey the Savior's warning. So what was the sign? The sign was the Romans' armies surrounding the city. Matthew 24:15-16 and Luke 21:20 and 21. When ye therefore see the abomination of desolation, this is Jesus speaking, spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them that are in Judea flee into the mountains. Great controversy, again, clarifies this some more. Christ had given his disciples warning, and all who believed his words watched for the promised sign. When ye shall see Jerusalem compassed by armies, said Jesus, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. So when they saw the armies, they knew the destruction was going to happen. Then let them that are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart. Great controversy again, page 26. The Savior warned his followers, when ye therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. When the idolatrous standards of the Romans had been set up in the holy ground, significant here, which extended some furlongs outside of the city, so that there was a footprint of what was called the holy ground that was even bigger than the city itself. Because the Roman armies didn't go into the city, they just surrounded it. But they were on the holy ground. So when the idolatrous standards, and those are their standards, their banners that have the symbols of their heathen gods, when the idolatrous standards of the Romans should be set up on the holy ground, which extended some furlongs outside the city walls, then the followers of Christ were to find safety in flight. When the warning signs should be seen, those who would escape must make no delay. Now here is a picture of the holy ground in connection to the temple. So you can see it goes some furlongs beyond the city. The Roman army standards or banners held the images of heathen gods under the direction of Cestius. So not only were these soldiers surrounding the city, but they held up these banners as directed by Cestius to show their heathen gods, to mock the God of the Israelites. Christians then recognized the Romans surrounding as a sign, but they couldn't leave because the city was under siege. When the Roman armies retreated for no apparent reason, the Jewish armies chased them. Christians in the city saw the sign that they were looking for and were unencumbered to leave the city. They fled to the place called Pella in the mountains. Now, this is an interesting thing. It was about 3.5 years from the first attack of Jerusalem by the Romans until they came back under the direction of Titus. It's interesting that the number 3.5 years is there. You'll recall in our earlier presentations there was some wonder of how long the little time of trouble might be, the first time of trouble, and I was speculating and surmising. I wonder if it might be 3.5 years. Well, here we're seeing 3.5 years again. 3.5 years from the first attack till the Romans came back. So keep in mind, at the beginning of this 3.5 years, the sign came, they surrounded the cities. The Christians who were believing, they left and went to Pella and didn't come back. It's quite significant in my mind that they didn't relax and go, well, hey, we left. There's nothing going on. Shoot, it's been a couple of years. Let's go back and be with our families. No, Jesus told them to flee. He didn't say come back. So they stayed. All of them stayed for 3.5 years. Then when the Titus came and destroyed the city without anybody getting able to get away, they were all safe. Country Living again, page 32. The time is not far distant when, like the early disciples, we shall be forced to seek refuge in desolate and solitary places. As the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman armies was a signal of flight to the Judean Christians, so the assumption of power on the part of our nation, the United States, in the decree enforcing the papal Sabbath, Sunday, as a law, will be a warning to us. So, according to this Country Living statement, the sign that we're looking for is a national Sunday law in the United States. It will then be time to leave the large cities, preparatory to leaving the smaller ones for retired homes and secluded places among the mountains. So what is a large city? Well, when this statement was written, the largest city at this time was around 100,000, Los Angeles. Well, by today's standard, 100,000 isn't much. At the time that we became convicted as a family to get out of Dodge and to move into the country, we were spending the winters in Mesa, Arizona. Mesa, Arizona is the largest suburb in the United States. It's almost 500,000. It's where lots of snowbirds go. There's lots of fun and golfing and senior parks and everything, but it's still a very large city, and we felt the call to get out. It is a suburb of Phoenix, and Phoenix is the largest, fifth largest city in the United States with over 1.5 million people. Phoenix and Mesa and Tempe and all these other, Scottsdale, these are all connected to each other. You can go from one city to the next and not even know you left. There's no country in between. So Mesa was a suburb of Phoenix. Definitely, by any definition, a large city. So for our family, it was time to get out of Dodge. Now, the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet was pagan Rome. It was the Roman armies as compared, it was pagan Rome. It wasn't religious, it was a heathen nation, Rome. The one that did the lions eating the Christians as entertainment in the great Colosseums and all that. That's who it was, pagan Rome. Abomination of desolation in its first application. What was the sign for this leaving the city of Jerusalem? Papal Rome, Revelation 13. Revelation 13 says that there's a second application to this, and it's Papal Rome. And Papal Rome is the one who persecuted Christians during the Dark Ages when they had to flee to the mountains and were burning people at the stake and all of that stuff. So we've got two Romes. One is the heathen Rome, and one is the religious geopolitical power of modern day Rome, Holy Roman Empire, the Roman Catholic Church. What is the sign of leaving the modern cities for us in this double application? What are we looking for? We are, according to the Country Living book. You know, this is really interesting. My friend Dave Westbrook, he's an ordained Seventh-day Adventist minister. He was pastored in Northern California and the Nevada-Utah conferences, and he now lives in Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho area, and is promoting moving in the country. He has Country Living University, which I have in the resource list in the end of the bottom of the website. I highly recommend his materials. But anyway, he was pondering this subject. Why do we have a statement where it would say it's in the future when we're supposed to leave the city, and another one would say it's in the past, you should have left? So here's what he discovered. Watch this carefully. The time is not far distant, Country Living, page 32. We've read it before. The time is not far distant when we, like the early disciples, will be forced to seek refuge, etc., etc. We've read this quote a couple times. Notice the date of this, 1885. That's when that statement was penned. Here's 1906 on the other side of the spectrum. Out of the cities, this is the message the Lord has been giving me. Okay, that doesn't say in the future. That's saying get out of Dodge. 1906. Now let's narrow the gap. 1903. The time has come when, as God opens the ways, families should move out of the cities. So this is not in the far distant future. This has already happened. 1903. 1900. Get out of the large cities as fast as possible. 1900. 1897. We're going backwards. We're trying to figure out, when did this change from in the future to in the past? When did this change happen? By looking at these dates. So 1897, I see the necessity for the people of God moving out of the cities, the necessity of making haste to get all things ready for the crisis. So there's a note of urgency. Let's get out, let's do it quick. Let's make haste. 1897. So what happened between 1885, the first quote we read a couple times, and 1897? The first one, 1885, said it's the time is not far distant, so it was in the future. By 1897, it was time to get out. So we've got a gap of 12 years, if I'm doing my math right, when it went from the quote that said it's in the future to the one that says it's time to get out. So what happened in between those two dates? Well, interestingly, what happened was the Blair Bill in 1888, which is right in the middle of those two dates. So the Blair Bill was it was a part of the U.S. Congress, and a congressman by the name of Blair introduced the bill to make a national Sunday law. Now this, of course, the people who were watching for the sign that there would be a national Sunday law really became alarmed and said, wait a minute. If this is the sign, wow, this is upon us. And even though there could be a note of excitement that, hey, this is the beginning of the end. It was also important to try to forestall it, to push it back so there was more time to spread the gospel. So a gentleman by the name of Alonzo T. Jones, a Seventh-day Adventist college professor of history, as I recall, and the editor of Liberty magazine, as I recall, was commissioned to draft up an argument to take to Congress to try to defeat the Blair bill. You can look this up on the internet. It's very well put together. It's many, 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 many pages long. It's an actual word-for-word transcript of this conversation between Congressman Blair and Alonzo Jones. And here is when it happened. Here's how it happened. Well, it was defeated providentially. And so then Blair came back again and tried again, and it was defeated again. So twice the Blair bill failed. And there was even, again, another issue having to do with the World's Fair, where there was a Sunday law that was an issue. But what I'd like to focus on is the two attempts of the Blair bill by Congressman Blair, and that it did not result in a national Sunday law. So if a person just read that first quote, that in the future, when there's a national Sunday law, then it's time to flee out of the large cities. Well, they could argue and say, well, this never happened. There never was a Sunday law. But you will also recall that these quotes that we read with these dates say that in between these two dates of 12 years, something happened that changed it. And I believe it was this Blair bill. Now, why would it then be the sign to move out of the city in 1888 with the Blair bill when it failed? Well, think about the Roman armies surrounding the city of Jerusalem. They were going to take over the city. They saw the sign, and then God miraculously took the sign away and opened the doors for them to be able to get down to business and move out of the city. I believe likewise that's what's happened here, that the National Sunday Law that was attempted in 1888, that was defeated, even though it was defeated, it was the first sign and was the signal to get out of the cities. At least for me and my family, that's my perception. The temple in Jerusalem were not destroyed by the Romans during the first siege. It was the return of the Romans later that resulted in the destruction. And you will notice that the destruction the second time, there was no escaping it. It was too late. Is it possible that the Blair bill was the first siege? I believe so. Do we see signs that the second siege is approaching? I also believe so. Even though the movements are subtle and hidden and kind of separated, I believe we're seeing early signs of movements toward a national Sunday law. There's increasing efforts are being made to move towards a national Sunday law. And as I've implied in the presentations earlier, I think that the initial versions of the Sunday law are going to be done not on religious grounds, but having to do with saving Mother Earth and the environment and preventing climate change. That's my hunch. We will have to wait and see. But read what the Catholic Catechism says. Quote, in respecting religious liberty and the common good for all, Christians should seek recognition of Sundays and the Church's holy days as legal holidays. So the Catholic Church is pushing for that there ought to be a national Sunday law. There are also Protestants who rally behind this idea. The Lord's Day Alliance of the United States. You know, close shop, worship, have time with your family, don't buy and sell. This is the website for the Lord's Day Alliance. Now, their mission, as on their website states, the object of the Lord's Day Alliance of the U.S. is to encourage all people to recognize and observe a day of Sabbath rest and to worship the risen Lord Jesus Christ on the Lord's Day, Sunday, and for the purpose of gathering and diffuse information, to publish documents, to use the press, to cause public addresses to be made, and to use other means as shall be expedient and proper, to the end that the blessings of the Lord's day and the benefits of the Sabbath shall be secured for all people. So the Lord's Day Alliance's goal is to secure the reverence of the Sunday, the Lord's Day, the Sabbath as they call it, for all people. Now, who's in this Lord's Day Alliance? Well, it's a cross-denominational lines. Notice that it is led by a board of managers comprising of clergy and laity, from Christian churches, and includes persons from Baptist, Catholic, Episcopalian, Friends, Lutheran, Methodist, non-denominational, Orthodox, Presbyterian, and Reformed traditions. What's their history? The Lord's Day Alliance of the United States was founded when? 1888. Is that interesting or what? That year, representatives of 6 major Protestant denominations met in Washington, D.C. to organize the American Sabbath Union, which later was changed to the name Lord's Day Alliance. The Lord's Day Alliance has been one national organization whose sole purpose is to maintain and cultivate the first day of the week as the time for rest, worship, Christian education, and spiritual renewal. They are unabashed in saying what their intentions are. They want a national Sunday law. And we know that that's the mark, the sign. Sunday is a mark of Christian unity. This is an article by one of their people. So, where else do we see some early warning signs of a national Sunday law maybe starting to percolate? Here's a European ad about protecting Sunday. And here's a interesting video clip of an Arizona senator who's explaining what she thinks ought to be done.
We should be debating a bill requiring every American to attend a church of their choice on Sunday to see if we can get back to having a moral rebirth.
And lastly, here's an ad from the United States.
In a work world, what difference will one day make? The earth won't alter its course. Cats and dogs will be cats and dogs. Rain will still fall from the sky. So take time for Sunday. Just know that your truck has a little thing for Monday.
So, Matthew 24, I believe, has a dual application. Jesus made that clear. The first one, abomination of desolation, the warning, the watchers in Jerusalem were looking for the sign. They knew it was the time to leave the cities, which they did. The first abomination of desolation warning for us in our day would be watchers leaving the large cities in times of peace. Matthew 24 parallels the last abomination of desolation warning, the believers protected by God from the final destruction of Jerusalem because they obeyed and they left. The last abomination in our day, believers will not be accepting the mark of the beast and will be protected by God from the death decree that the book of Revelation talks about. So here are some interesting questions to contemplate. Why do you think there was a delay of 3.5 years from the Christians being told to flee Jerusalem during the first siege until the second siege and the destruction of Jerusalem? Why do you think Noah and his family sat in the ark for a week before the rain came? Why do you think God has delayed for over 100 years since the first attempt of the National Sunday Law by the Blair Bill? Why do you think the man who warned the 7 years of doom of Jerusalem died during the destruction? As with my other presentations, I'm ending with 2 Bible quotes, Romans 12:12. Let your hope make you glad. Be patient in time of trouble and never stop praying. Psalms 46:1. God is an ever-present help in times of trouble. During these times, God offers us peace and assurance and an opportunity to prepare for the troubled times soon to come.